In 1791, his final year, the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart seems to have been quite busy, writing 2 string quintets, one of the last 3 symphonies, many dances for court balls. Commissions were rolling in, one of them for the accession to the throne of King of Bohemia, Leopold II, which eventually resulted in the opera La Clemenza di Tito. Also a requiem commissioned under mysterious circumstances by Count Walsegg-Stupak. But nothing seems to have pleased Mozart more than a collaboration with his old friend Emanuel Schikaneder, who was the impresario of the Theater auf der Wieden on the outskirts of Vienna. That collaboration resulted in Die Zauberflöte, the Magic Flute, one of the most beloved and certainly one of the strangest works to come from Mozart's pen. That is the subject of our operatic exploration today. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. The Magic Flute deals with a young prince. His name is Tamino, and when we meet him at the beginning of the opera, he's running through a forest being pursued by a giant serpent. He's rescued by 3 strange ladies. They are attendants to the Queen of the Night. The queen has a daughter, Pamina, who has been kidnapped by a mysterious potentate by the name of Zarastro. The queen asks Tamino to rescue Pamina, and he agrees. And off he goes along with his companion, the queen's birdcatcher, Papageno, one of the great comic characters in all opera. Pamina has been abducted by one of Zarastro's servants, Monostatos. And in a great comic scene, Papageno frightens Monostatos and he runs off, and Pamina is free to be rescued. In the meantime, Tamino has a confrontation with one of Zarastro's priests, and he begins to change his mind about this so-called wicked demon. He realizes that Zarastro stands for the principles of virtue and truth, of wisdom. And so he and Papageno agree to go through a certain initiation, ordeals and trials, in order to become members of Zarastro's tribe. The second act of the opera deals entirely with these trials, a trial of silence, trial by fire and by water. And at the end of the opera, Tamino, Pamina, Papageno reigned victorious over the villainous Queen of the Night and her cohorts. This is a fanciful and, as I said, rather strange plot for an opera. But ever since its first run at the Theater auf der Wieden in 1791, it's been one of the most beloved operas ever written. Let's take a close look now at the time of the writing of the Magic Flute and the life and some of the myths surrounding the life and death of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. There are so many myths dealing with Mozart's life and death that it's sometimes difficult for us to distinguish fact from fiction. One of them is that Mozart died a pauper, that he was never able to handle money or that he gambled it all away. That, in fact, is not true. What is true is that in the last 4 or 5 years of Mozart's life, he did borrow some money from various friends. But it's also true that lots of money came rolling in. In fact, 1791, which was his last year, seems to have been his most successful financially. Not counting money that may or may not have come in for the Magic Flute commission, Mozart made nearly 2,000 florins in that year. Now that would be the equivalent of about $40,000 or $50,000 in today's terms. That made Mozart a very stable member of the Viennese bourgeoisie. Another myth of sorts was Mozart's never having received a royal position from the Habsburgs, and this also is not true. It's just that Mozart didn't have the position he coveted. The one he really wanted was the position of royal court composer. This was held, of course, by the Italian composer Antonio Salieri, who was very popular in his day. Mozart did hold a minor position, that position the royal court chamber music composer. For this, Mozart had to write dance music, music for all of the royal balls, the court celebrations that occurred in every season of the royal life. And it was quite lucrative. It brought in quite a bit of money for Mozart. The thing was, by 1791, Joseph II had been dead for nearly a year. Leopold, his younger brother, ascended to the throne, and he was nowhere near as interested in the arts or opera or music as his older brother was. And so Mozart and other composers and artists decided that the Habsburg milieu was no longer going to be helpful to them monetarily. In fact, Mozart ran a bit afoul of Leopold II and his empress when they finally heard La Clemenza di Tito, which was commissioned by Prague in order to celebrate Leopold's ascension to the throne of the King of Bohemia. The empress said, and I quote, "This is a bit of una porcheria tedesca," a little bit of German hogwash. Well, Mozart was a realist, and he realized that there was no future for him in the court of Leopold II. Another myth is that Mozart was buried in a pauper's grave. This, too, is not at all true. He was buried in a common grave. Joseph II, some years before, had dictated that all funeral services, processions, obsequies were to be simplified, and for sanitary reasons, people were to be buried in a common grave. A grave would be dug at the beginning of a week. Anyone who died that week would be buried in it, lined over, and then at the end of the week, the grave would be covered over. It was not meant for poor people, it was meant for the middle class. It was a very simple problem of space. There were no more grave sites available. There was very little ground left to be able to bury people. One of the great myths which refuses to go away, and which is propagated certainly by Peter Schaffer's play Amadeus and the film based on the script, is that Salieri somehow was involved in killing Mozart and poisoning Mozart. This has been debunked so many times by musicologists and scholars that it's really not necessary to go into here. But it's difficult for us to accept the fact that a 36-year-old young man could have had such a remarkable life and produced such wonderful pieces of music that his death couldn't have been somehow remarkable as well. In fact, Mozart's death was quite unremarkable. He died of rheumatic fever due to the limitations of 18th century medicine. The composition of the Magic Flute seems to have taken up the bulk of the summer and early fall of Mozart's last year. The collaboration with Schikaneder was something that depended on their history, Schikaneder being an actor of great comic talent who toured with his own company throughout the German-speaking lands. In 1780, in fact, Schikaneder appeared in Salzburg, and that is where Mozart and Schikaneder first met. The actor was known for his portrayal of the role of Hamlet. He was a great interpreter of Shakespeare, as well as Schiller and Goethe and some of the other classic German playwrights. And he finally became the director or impresario of a small theater in the outskirts of Vienna. It was called the Theater auf der Wieden, or the Freihaus Theater. It was a theater that attracted audiences from many levels of society, not only aristocratic, but middle class and even the poorer classes. Schikaneder was also a canny administrator who was able to come up with interesting ways to solve his company's financial problems. In fact, the Magic Flute may have been one of those solutions. We know that the company was going under financial woes, difficulties at the time, and he seems to have approached Mozart with the possibility of creating a piece that would attract as large an audience as possible. Schikaneder demanded that it be a Singspiel. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of the Singspiel. It goes back, strangely enough, to England, where the English composer John Gay wrote a play with music called The Beggar's Opera. It was translated into German and first performed in Germany in the early 18th century. It began a form then of Singspiels, of pieces of theater which were partly sung and partly spoken, which had fantastic stories. The stories were taken from fairy tales and poetry. As a matter of fact, the source for the magic flute seems to have come from a publication from 1786, a collection of fairy tales that were quasi-oriental, entitled The Djinnistan. And from this collection of stories was the story of Prince Lulu, of all things, Prince Lulu and the magic flute. There seem to have been other sources for the magic flute. Most importantly, the symbolism, the numerology, and the ritual of the Freemasons, a secret society of which both Schikaneder and Mozart were members. All of the commentaries on the magic flute tell us how important Freemasonry is to the libretto and certainly to the music. So I thought we'd take a little time now to explore that subject with my friend, musicologist Ron Shaheen. Ron, welcome.
Thanks.
It's good to have you here. First of all, what exactly is Freemasonry?
Well, Freemasonry is an organization that traced its roots as far back as the Middle Ages and the stone mason guilds of that time. But it was only in the 18th century that the Masonic lodges or that Freemasonry really came to bloom, because it sort of rode the tails of the Enlightenment movement. Mm-hmm. Freemasonry believed in improving the humanity or the human race through the improvement of each individual unit, therefore sort of building a temple of humanity.
So it was part and parcel to the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment.
Yes, exactly.
Just how popular was Freemasonry in 18th century Vienna?
Well, I don't know that popular would be the best word, because that kind of gives it a large-scale appeal to all classes. In fact, it was popular, if you want to use that word, to the middle and upper classes. Mm-hmm. You had to be educated, of course. You had to be an adult male. You had to believe in God. You had to believe in the immortality of the soul. And it was quite important for both social and, I guess, philosophical reasons for men of any caliber to be a Mason, mm-hmm. to be part of a Masonic order.
Was it fully accepted by the Habsburg Empire?
Yes and no. They tolerated it in the middle of the 18th century, from the 1760s up until the 1780s. They tolerated it. But when Joseph II became the sole ruler of the empire, he had liberal policies that allowed for a greater expression, not just in association, but in the press and in religious affiliation. And so Freemasonry enjoyed, in the early 1780s, a real renaissance. However, Joseph's reforms were taken advantage of. Freedom of the press got out of hand in his eyes, with mm-hmm. a great number of pamphlets being critical of the empire, and there actually being a flux of subversive literature being published, not by the Masons. But unfortunately, the Masons, because they were a secret society, got a lot of the blame for it. Mm-hmm. And therefore, in 1785, Joseph II made a proclamation that basically took control or some oversight over the Masonic orders, and that tended to dampen mm-hmm. the enthusiasm for Masonry.
Of course, I would imagine the Habsburgs were a little concerned about what was going on in France at the time.
Exactly.
It was like the age of enlightenment gone
yes,
rampant.
Exactly. In fact, there was a French Masonic tract in which the French Masons claimed that it was through them that the French Revolution actually was going to occur, and that put the fear of overthrow in the Habsburgs.
Absolutely. And of course, his little sister Marie
yes.
happened to be...
lost her head over the whole thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, how and why did Mozart get involved in Masonry? And was he was he serious about it? Was it something that he really took to heart?
Well, as I said, Masonry attracted many philosophers, politicians, clergy members, and artists. Mm-hmm. And of course, Mozart would be attracted to that kind of thinking. He was very serious about being a Mason. He was elevated to the to all three levels. He was a master Mason. He composed music for Masonic ceremonies. The most famous, I guess, or the most important would be the Masonic funeral music. And when Mozart died, they had a memorial lodge, they would call it a memorial service, for Mozart in his lodge.
How did Mozart and Schikaneder weave the principles of Freemasonry into the magic flute?
Well, they did it in a couple ways. The most important way, I would say, is through the story itself. You have a young man, a prince, Tamino, who is seeking enlightenment. He's seeking to be an initiate in the temple of Sarastro. And he goes through various trials, moving from darkness to light. And in the end, he is accorded a position with the other priests, being a master Mason, I guess is what you would say. Yeah.
Would members of the audience at the time have recognized any of the symbols that were in
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Anyone that was a Mason would know what was going on. They would recognize the number 3, which was very popular with the Masons. It was a sacred number to the Masons.
So wasn't all this supposed to be secret?
Well, yes and no. People were writing about Masonic rites, and these things were being published. Even some of the lodges had libraries where people could go in and read about it. The women, who were not allowed to be Masons, certainly knew some of the things that were going on. The secrecy aspect really pertained only to the rites themselves, only to what happened in the lodges when a person was elevated or promoted along the ranks. Had nothing to do with the government or religion or anything like that. Those were the only things that were secret. And also people that were Masons and then fell away or for whatever reason became antagonistic to Masons would publish things about Masonry, revealing, Freemasonry revealed, telling people what it was all about.
Right.
So people would know what was going on.
Now, one final question. What's interesting about the magic flute is, of course, that through the ordeal that Tamino undergoes in the opera, which is kind of an opera-long process for him, Pamina joins him at the end. Now, aren't the Masons supposed to be an all-male secret society?
That's very true, and there are a lot of references in the opera telling Tamino to be silent and don't listen to women because they chatter, and in fact, many Masons wrote that women in the lodges would distract them from their work, but I think that is a corruption of what Masons really believed. Truly, they thought there are some writings that women would distract men from their work and therefore they were not allowed in the lodge. But in reality, the symbolism of the magic flute has to do with the 3 temples. For example, you had the temple of reason, wisdom, and nature. And I think Tamino represents reason, Pamina represents nature, and Sarastro represents wisdom. And you need to have reason and nature combined with the blessing of Sarastro, with the blessing of wisdom, to be a whole person and to attain enlightenment. That's why Pamina is included in the final apotheosis.
It's fascinating stuff. Thanks very, very much for being with us.
Welcome. Thank you, Nick.
The most interesting thing about the fabric of magic flute is, of course, the Masonic symbolism that we talked about before, but is also in the music. We know that the number 3 was very, very important to Masonic ritual. Everything happened in order of 3s and lots of numbers, different levels of Masonic ritual and symbolism were divisible by 3. So Mozart plays a game of 3s with us in the music. For instance, the overture is in E flat. Well, E flat has 3 flats. And how does the overture begin? With 3 chordal gestures. Which are almost imitating the secret knock that the Masons at the time in Vienna used to gain entrance to their Masonic lodge. After those three chordal gestures, the overture continues. And a few bars later, the tempo picks up and the overture goes its merry way. Until at one point it comes to a screeching halt, and we think actually the overture is over. And what do we get? Three more chordal gestures. Made up, interestingly enough, of three chords each. And then the overture picks up tempo and goes on. It's really fascinating that these three chordal gestures interrupt the flow of the opera at different points. And Mozart, not only in the music but in the libretto with Schickenator, is constantly playing this game of threes with us. There are three ladies in waiting to the Queen of the Night. There are three slaves who help Monostatos. There are three boys who give advice to Papageno and Tamino as they undergo their ordeals. At the beginning of Act 2, 18 priests, which is 6 times 3, a rather perfect form of 3, enter and sit down at 18 chairs. Sarastro, the high priest, has a little bit of a monologue and again is interrupted by the Masonic symbol. It's a fascinating way of tying drama, ritual, Masonic mystery all together in a wonderful fabric that we call the magic flute. The magic flute is very well represented in recording history. There must be at least 25 or 30 excellent recordings of the magic flute for you to run out and buy to get to know the piece before you come see it at the opera. Here are 5 of my favorites. First of all is this recording from the early music arena using period instruments, Mozart's magic flute conducted by William Christie and the ensemble and orchestra Les Arts Florissants. It's an absolutely sparkling and delightful recording of the opera. It is paired with Nicholas Harnoncourt's conducting of Die Zauberflöte. This, too, is a period music approach. It's about 10 years old, but is absolutely delightful. You'll find some of the tempos to be a little strange, but it grows on you. I love this recording. A newer entry into the recorded history of the magic flute is Sir George Scholte's recording with the Wiener Staatsoper of the magic flute. A wonderful recording and terrific stereo digital sound. One of my all-time favorites is this historic recording from 1959, also from the Wiener Staatsoper, George Sell at the podium, and a brilliant cast, Leopold Simoneau, Lisa Della Casa, and Walter Berry. This is a live recording, of course, but it absolutely sparkles with delight. Finally, the classic recording of the magic flute conducted by Karl Böhm with the inimitable Fritz Wunderlich as Tamino, Roberta Peters as the Queen of the Night, and Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau as Papageno. You cannot do better than this classic recording. All 5 of these recordings are readily available for you at your local CD store. Run out and get one. I think you'll truly enjoy it. You've seen now how the story, as well as the music, are fraught with Masonic influence, symbolism, and ritual. But what does that have to do with us, an audience in the 21st century, approaching this piece for the first time, or perhaps approaching the piece from a point of familiarity, but never really being able to understand what's going on? The Magic Flute, remember, is really about a journey from darkness into light. It's a journey which goes from initiation to a period of trial and then into enlightenment. Now, this is the basis of the Masonic ritual, and it was a point of genius, I think, that Schikaneder and Mozart used this as the basic structure of the opera, because it is also a very basic structure of all of the important human rites of passage. Think of Christian conversion, for instance, initiation, a period of study and understanding, moving into baptism and a period of enlightenment. Or of the Jewish ritual of bar or bat mitzvah, where a child goes through the journey into adulthood. It's sort of basic to human existence. The Magic Flute, fantastical, mysterious, ritualistic, and inspirational. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I hope you are too. I'm Nick Reveles, and I'll see you at the opera.